And this idea of tradition, and there's an explanation in that song that says, tradition helps you know your place in society and what is expected of you and how you are supposed to behave. You know where you stand. Not so much today. Our traditions, there's traditions that I don't understand them. And as I look around, there seems to be traditions that we get locked into. And Jesus' criticism of the tradition is not so much the tradition itself, but you make loopholes. And you find a way to get around those. Because just in the paragraph before, he says, you don't honor God because you say, the law says, honor your mother and father, but you find a loophole to say, oh, I gave that to the church, I tithed on that, and so I'm honoring you by taking care of the church and neglecting my duty to you. Jesus says, you honor me with your lips, but your hearts are far away from me. In vain you worship, teaching human precepts as doctrine. Washing hands before your meal. It's good hygiene, right? If you saw people around you, your children don't wash their hands before they eat. Oh no, it's left them anyway. Give them a stern talking to and say, you need to wash your hands, hand sanitizer, do the 20 seconds under the rule. What Jesus is talking about here is not a hygiene rule, but it's a ritual purity. The Pharisees would go out into the marketplace, and when they came back home, they'd do this whole ritual cleansing, just in case they'd shook hands with someone who had a demon, and perhaps that demon had come onto them for somehow or another. And so they were so concerned to preserve holiness that they were drawing further and further back, building walls ever taller and bigger around them. But Jesus reminds what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart. The words, the action reveal our character. And at the same time that Jesus is saying, these externals don't really matter, it is what happens in the heart. He doesn't reduce what is expected of us, but actually increases that. Remember, he says, if you say if you think in your heart murderous thoughts, it's as though you've committed murder to someone. It's what happens on the inside affects what happens on the outside. But what caught my attention in this passage, verse 12, the Pharisees took offense. The disciples come, oh, Jesus, don't you know that you really offended, the leadership at this point? Did Jesus care? There's a lot here going on, and I need to be careful that we don't just read this as it doesn't matter who you offend. Just go out and just do whatever and cause offense wherever. Because just causing offense doesn't mean that you're being holy. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes offense is just plain being rude, being inconsiderate to people. So we need to be very careful here what is causing the offense. And the Greek word here that is used is a word scandalon. And it's one of those key words that pop up from time to time. And it's literally a stumbling block. And in 1 Corinthians it says, we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, a scandalon, and to the Gentiles foolishness. Why is Jesus a stumbling block? In Romans 9 it says, Israel stumbled over the stumbling stone, the scandalon, for it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone, a rock of offense. What is it why does God kind of poke us and prod us in this point? Why does he put, the stumbling block in the way, this Jesus who comes and challenges the fine print in the contract? Maybe we need to go back and read that fine print and say, what's all this about? Where is this going? How is this building me in my character? It might seem like the Pharisees have perceived Jesus as a heretic. That word scandalon is an interesting word because it literally means a trap, like a bear trap. You know those big bear traps? And it's the bait stick that is sitting over there. And so the Pharisees are saying, you're setting a trap for people, and this is going to catch them. You need to be careful how you live your life on the outside, because this is a slippery slope. You start letting the washing of the hands go, and next thing you're not washing your body. Next thing you doing all sorts of other things. Argument sounds good. And Jesus reminds us, what's going on the inside? Why are you wanting to control people on the outside? The second part of this reading, kind of the scene shifts, and it's a little bit more difficult. This Canaanite woman that comes before Jesus and shouting out, and the disciples say, "Oh, Jesus, please just send her away. She's so irritating. Just get rid of her." And Jesus answers. We assume he answers the woman, but it's a little bit vague. He says, "I'm only sent to the lost people of Israel." Was he talking to the disciples, or was he talking to the woman? But somehow or another, she overhears this and came across this little saying, which I think, to paraphrase, to translate what Jesus is saying to her, is, "Not my circus, not my monkeys. You're not my problem. I have a job to do. I have a task to do. This is not what it is." And here's the thing. Is she offended by Jesus? I'm offended by what Jesus says in this point. But she's not offended. She just keeps on. She keeps on. And she falls at his knees, and the words that she says are an echo of what Peter said last week. "Lord, help me." What happened when Peter shouted that out? Immediately his hand was on Peter's hand and saved him. And immediately Jesus looks at her and says, "What great faith you have." The Greek word there is megala, mega faith. She has got mega faith in Jesus. She's not put off by, this Jewish man just pushing her aside and saying, "I don't have time for your problems, man." She pushes on because you know what's in her heart? Love for her daughter who's being tormented. And that love is oozing out of who she is. She will do anything. She will not care about anything. She is not offended. She's pushing on, pushing through in this point. Love for her daughter. She knows that Jesus can transform. So that is in her heart, that belief that Jesus can actually do something in this situation. And so she's going to press in until he does something. She wasn't going home that day. She wasn't going to leave him alone. She doesn't care for the protocols or the posturing or the pretty dresses or whatever. She's persistent. Faithfulness, faith does not give up. Faith says, this is tough. There's obstacles in the way. There's traps that I need to be careful of, but I'm pushing on, pushing through. There's something of the same character that shines through Joseph. Down in the pit, in the prison in Egypt, growing in Pharaoh's courts, never seems to corrupt him. He's always faithful to God. No matter what the circumstances, down in the dumps or up in the sky. And in the end, his goal is to save the family. Lord, help us. But in the process, he doesn't just save his family, he saves Egypt, those people who worshipped Osiris and all sorts of other gods. He didn't convert them, but he saved them. He was faithful to God through the years of abuse, through prison, and through success. And perhaps sometimes being faithful to God in success is more difficult than when things are going tough, isn't it? Because when it's going tough, you're there, you have to depend on God, because otherwise you're not going to get through, right? And then all of a sudden things ease off and you can relax a bit, you can take a step back, you can sit down, you put feet up, watch TV a little bit, and a little bit. Next thing, where are you? where you are, you lose your place in your notes. As I thought about the scandalon, the stumbling block, and how Joseph was actually a stumbling block, a scandalon to his family. The Old Testament passage doesn't use that word, but remember when he comes to them with his dream, he says, I'm going to be the ruler over you. If your little brother came to you and did that, my older sister sitting in the back there, if someone did that to you, how do you feel? Do you feel offended by that? And they were. Enough to beat him up, throw him down a pit. As he shared his vision of what God had for them, he became a stumbling block to them. They weren't able to see past the little kid with a pretty coat. Actually, that word for the coat is only used one other time for like a dress that a princess wears. So I don't know what that means for the story, but here's Joseph with this pretty coat on. And it offended the brothers. This preferential treatment that he got, a scandalon, it became a trap for them because they couldn't get past their own issues that they had. And in the end, the story that we read from Genesis chapter 45, there's a scandalon here as well. There's a trap for us, because what does Joseph do? He goes against convention. He doesn't get revenge. He doesn't get even. He doesn't make them pay the price for what they did to him. He forgives them. Forgiveness is scandalous. When you begin to extend forgiveness and grace to people in your community who others think don't deserve it, that becomes a scandalon. And people are going to want to stomp on you for it. People are going to be offended by it. And they're going to make your life difficult through that process. But what is in your heart? Is it for your own self-edification that you're heading down this track? Or is it to empower people to know the grace of God at work in them? Joseph demonstrates justice that doesn't mete out punishment or vengeance in the name of justice, but he resorts to restorative justice and turns enemies into friends. That's a scandalon in itself, a trap, an offense in itself. How do you know? Our world tells us that enemies need to be obliterated. Why? Because they might rise up again and catch you when you're unawares. Restorative justice turns the circumstances that we find ourselves in into opportunities to see God at work. Turns a curse into the kindness of God. None of this denies injustice and that there is this trap of fear that seems to bait us in. But the opposite of fear is faith that looks past these stumbling blocks, looks past the hurdles and looks to God. Peter walking on the water with as he's sinking down, Lord, help me. This woman before Jesus, Lord, help me. Help me get past these stumbling blocks. Help me get past these things, the offenses that seem to hold me back. And Jesus restores the broken. He frees the prisoner from the circumstances of our own making. Understanding the offensiveness of God's grace is the beginning of our own transformation. Turning our heart and our inner self, that center of motivation, to desire God's life. To desire God as the source of love and the giver of life. To see our dirty hands and say, it's okay. To know our desperation and fall before Jesus and say, Lord, help me. And to experience his provision and his healing as he pours his grace down into our lives. The story, the rest of that chapter in Matthew goes on that Jesus goes into the area and he feeds the 4,000. And sometimes what God wants of us is to stop posturing and stop working out, what all the fine points are and what might happen if we don't do this or if we do this, but just to respond to God's grace by giving grace to others, by sharing what we have with others, and trusting that God will help us in that process. That God will take that kindness that we sow in people's lives, and He will use it, perhaps as a stumbling block for them, to show up what is in their hearts so that they are able to deal with it. What God does with them is up to them. What God does with us and the offenses that we face in our lives is up to us. So the question is, as we face offenses and we feel slighted or offended by people, how do we deal with that? Will we allow that to be a mirror for us to look inside and say, where is that emotion coming from? Is this something that is touching me and my pride and my sense of what is right and what is wrong? Am I able to give this up to God like Joseph did and say, well, Lord, I'm in a bad way. I'm in a pit. I'm in a hole. I've been beaten up. I've been thrown down here. But you know what, Lord? I'm going to trust you. And I'm going to be consistent with what you've put in my heart. And I'm going to love, and I'm going to bless, and I'm going to look to you to fix this up, rather than me take justice into my own hands. Let's pray.